Hello and welcome to Your Corner of the World, a series of interviews on diverse topics presented by the Brown Arts Initiative. My name is Kate Kraczon, and I'm the new curator at the David Winton Bell Gallery at Brown University. I've invited curator and art historian, and I would argue activist, Millar Fisher, to discuss how the COVID-19 crisis is affecting the museum field and to offer strategies on how we can move forward. Michelle is currently a curator at the MFA Boston and has worked at the Guggenheim and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She has also taught widely, including at CUNY, Parsons, University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard. Last year, Michelle co-founded the labor collective Art and Museum Transparency after creating an open source spreadsheet with colleagues to collect salary information across the museum field. She remains their public-facing representative as they work to track the massive layoffs, furloughs, and salary cuts that are currently happening in museums across the United States. Though I have only been at the Bell for 9 months, I've been in the museum field for 18 years, I realized this past week. First as an intern at the Wexner Center for the Arts and the Andy Warhol Museum, and then as an employee at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago and the Institute of Contemporary Art at Penn. I have also worked at music and bookstores and supported myself financially for many years as a waitress and bartender while interning unpaid at all of those previous museums. Michelle, you've held many positions outside the art world as well, right? It's something that you and I've talked a lot about.
Yeah. No, I've done nannying, I've done waitressing. I've been a nanny longer than I've been a curator. I'm not nannying right now, but I was nannying into my time at MoMA, actually. I've been a dishwasher, I've been a bartender, I've done transcribing work, all different types of things. So I have a longer resume outside of museums than I do in them. And I've been in museums in the US since 2005, and I did some early arts experiences in the UK, so probably just about the same amount of time as UK.
Yeah. And I was actually talking to our colleague, Stamatina Gregory, who's the chief curator at Leslie Lohman Museum, and she says you organized a babysitting collective when you were all graduate students. So I feel like organizing has been very much part of your world for a long time, even before Art and Museum Transparency.
Yeah, I remember actually when I was 15 years old, I realized that the first time I organized was then. I realized that in my tipping is not big in the UK, tipping culture, but whenever I waitressed, we did get tipped, and we didn't get any of those tips. They were taken away by the owner. And I realized actually that we were doing a really, really good job. Me and my best friend, Penny, actually, we waitressed every single night, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from when we were 15 to 18 and left for college. And I asked, and I went in, I remember being terrified at the time. Nobody else would come in with me, but I remember going into his office and saying, I want those tips, and I want everyone else to have those tips, and if you don't give us them, then we're leaving. And we left that night thinking that we didn't have a job because the response was not favorable at all. And then I got a phone call the next day. They realized that we were good at our jobs, and it was more useful for us to be given what now I look back on, and it probably was not that much money for them, than for us to leave. And so, yes, I feel very strongly about labor rights, and I realized, like most people, we've had to think about them from day one.
And I wanted to contextualize our previous employment, both inside and outside of the cultural sector, because we are entering a period when many of us will have to pivot and rethink short-term employment or even careers. Michelle, can you speak more about the inception of Art and Museum Transparency, as well as the information you are gathering about this current moment? Because I remember you and I talked about a spreadsheet about a month, I think, before you launched it. So I was so excited that you were quite brave in being the public face of this movement. I would describe it as a movement at this point.
We had a lot of precedents. So I remember when I was a graduate teaching fellow at CUNY, that was in the same time period that Joshua Bolt, who was also an adjunct, not at CUNY, but was an adjunct professor, had put together the adjunct salary spreadsheet in 2012. And so his work inspired us. We were also inspired that there was the POW arts salary survey that had been, the survey instrument had been sent out, the survey itself hadn't been released quite yet. And then in the same month, actually, Kimberly Drew at the Association of American Art Museums spoke directly about her salary experiences at the Met. And so there was a really good, body of people who'd been talking in this way for long before art and museum transparency had been. But in short, the project came from one evening talking with a group of colleagues who all worked in museums. Several were applying for jobs, figuring out that process that many of us have gone through before of what to put on your cover letter, and to you're often asked to state your salary, you're often asked to state salary history. Sometimes now that is illegal in some states, including in Massachusetts, where I am now. And out of that conversation came the idea that if we had all just, which we did, shared our salaries with one another, why didn't we put that in some kind of concrete place? So on the way home, using Google Drive, we created this spreadsheet and sent it out to friends, and then sent it out on our social media. And then I also sent it to the CUNY list of the art history program, who are about 400 strong and really smart and amazing people. And from that, it just grew exponentially, very, very quickly. And so there's about 3,500 entries there now. It spawned lots of newspaper articles, so people started talking about it in the field. People in leadership couldn't ignore it. We followed it up with an internship spreadsheet, a union organizing resources spreadsheet, op-eds, a Twitter handle, which is very, very active now especially, but has always been, and a series of newsletters that we send out. And so now we're tracking, as part of, again, many, many other people doing similar work. There's a great spreadsheet that Michelle Moon, who is an employee, I think a furloughed employee at the Tenement Museum in New York, has put out, looking at at totaling up the furloughs, layoffs, pay cuts, and other sort of ramifications of what's happening with COVID in terms of the museum and the art world. But at the moment, we are very closely tracking these effects that the last 5 weeks have had on our field, and being a connecting hub for parts of the conversation that are happening, everything from people wondering how to get unemployment benefits, to starting mutual aid groups, to recent graduates who are coming into the field or who are studying currently and have real trepidation and concern about how they are going to be able to have a career in this space that they've been preparing so hard for.
I think such an important factor in both the spreadsheet as well as in your Twitter account, which is aggregating all of this information, is that it allows for anonymity. I know that some of us entered our information along with our institution, and if you're in a small department, it's pretty easy to guess who is who, but then other people were given the freedom in the way it was set up to share information as a colleague without directly pointing to who you are in your institution. And I want to add, early on, and maybe we can repeat it later, it is your legal right to speak with your colleagues about your work situation and your salary. I've been in meetings at museums, not currently, previous institutions, where we were told not to share our salary information, but it's actually a protected right under union laws, correct?
Same with organizing.
Yes.
So you're able to discuss your salary. You're absolutely, totally fine to. And you're also allowed to talk about working conditions as part of organizing. And so this is not something that is outside of your legal rights within a work scenario.
And what I also love about what Art and Museum Transparency are doing these past couple of weeks, if not the last 2 months, as you aggregate and amplify, is giving voice to museum workers who are so outside the scope of the very specific contemporary artwork that you and design, contemporary art and design work that you and I do, because I didn't realize the percentage. AAMD released that 4% of museums across the country are art museums. I would have guessed 25.
Yeah.
So we're a very small segment, and we have a very loud voice in the media in terms of contemporary art especially. But there are incredible colleagues in historical and regional institutions across the United States that are contributing and tagging art and museum transparency and then becoming more visible. So I've started following people who I don't know if I would have connected with otherwise, who are just have brilliant takes on the contemporary moment, both nationally, but also what makes sense in their region at their institution and in their particular field, depending on what type of museum it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's so important to remember that You know, if something is happening to somebody else within a working situation today, it could very well be you tomorrow. And there has been historically a very significant art world exceptionalism where what happens in the art world is seen as separate and different and somehow discrete from other types of labor struggle. And it's not at all. And I think that's a good manifesto or motto to live by, whatever situation that you're in. I was lucky to be in an undergraduate program in Glasgow and then at the CUNY Grad Centre, where it was incredibly collegial. People really took care of one another, because if you were facing an issue, large or small, you knew that somebody else had probably faced it before you, somebody else would after you. And so the notion of collective action was always very much part of the ethos of where I have gone to school and the people that I've known. And I think that factors into thinking about labor within our field as well. Not only are art museums a small percentage of museums in general, but if you think about social history museums, historic sites, other places, they actually deal with labor as a topic in much more direct ways a lot of the time, in terms of the missions that they have, in terms of the content that they work with every single day. And so we can learn a huge amount, because often, I mean, I think part of the issue that we have in our field and have had over the last few years and indeed decades is that we have missions that say one thing to a public audience and do one thing maybe in the galleries, but don't always back that up in the way that their HR departments are run. And so it's instructive to look to other models outside of the very limited field of the art museum model.
And in terms of the press coverage of this crisis in the museum field, it really has been focused on New York arts institutions. I don't know if I'm missing something in the major national newspapers, LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post. Obviously, it's proximity to those journalists, and also probably the glamour of the money that can be thrown around in terms of director salaries. But there has been a lot of coverage, and those institutions were pretty much the first to set a precedent of mass layoffs and furloughs. And I know you spoke in a really rich conversation last week at the Vera List Center at the New School that people can access online. And I would recommend that everyone watch that panel, which was taped and available on their website. But I wonder if you'd be open to running through some of those statistics that you shared in that conversation about where we're at least our little art and design segment of the museum field in terms of layoffs, furloughs, salary cuts. A lot of my close colleagues have had salary cuts at their museums, and these have been so far standalone institutions. I have been following university institutions, which are more stable, but also in many ways working in a sometimes different fiscal year as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see some of these statistics, or all of them actually, and newer ones as they get added under the hashtag museum layoffs, which is something that we've been building out on Art Museum Transparency, but many other people are using now too. And it really does, as you say, help us to think beyond just the model of institutions in New York, LA, or other larger metropolises. I think it's really interesting. So often it's the same with a lot of worker stories. If you read about what happens in terms of labor in general, but specifically in the museum field, and very specifically in the art museum field, where there's so much money to throw around, especially in contemporary art, it's fairly likely that a story that you read in this area is going to have quotes in it from museum board members, directors, leadership, but it's the rare story that actually centers the conversations that workers are having, especially those who are experiencing pay cuts and furloughs and layoffs. We saw that happen a little bit differently with some of the coverage around unions over the last year. And so there are some stories, some labor and arts writers who are making a difference. I think of someone like Zachary Small, for example, writing for Hyperallergic, the art newspaper, and now the New York Times. But the general trend is not to highlight these stories, and I think it's really important to. So some of the statistics, and I'll run through just a few of them. The Carnegie Museum's furloughed 550 staff of a total of 1,003 staff. 75% of those furloughed are part-timers. The remaining staff are going to get pay cuts of 10 to 20%. The Science Museum of Minnesota laid off 450 of about 500 staff. They're paying medical benefits just through next week, through April 30th. The Tenement Museum in New York laid off about 70 part-time and 13 full-time staff. Mass MoCA laid off 120 of 165 full-time staff and part-time staff effective April 11th. They're paying health insurance for those insured through the museum through July. The Franklin Institute in Philly laid off 55 full-time and 154 part-time employees, some of whom only found out when they woke up and they were just logged out of their institutional email. MoMA sent out an email from its education admin address to around 60 part-time educators saying that their services were no longer needed and it would be, quote, months, if not years, before they'd be able to staff up again. And then the Philadelphia Museum of Art has not laid off or furloughed anyone, instead giving everyone over $30,000 a year, as if they're on that salary or above, a pay cut of 10%, moving to 20% in some cases, and executive salaries are being cut by about 60%. So there are different responses and strategies, but everything is about constricting the labor market within the field at the moment.
Right. And despite calls for transparency, museums are not currently disclosing staffing cuts and furloughs through their public-facing platforms, such as email announcements, social media, and website updates, and are instead presenting content online, often as if they were not in a crisis. And the irony is that much of this content was developed by now unemployed or furloughed staff. There was also little transparency from senior administration to museum employees. I want to add that I feel that there's been quite a bit of transparency at Brown, and I'm very happy to be at this institution. We get several updates a week, and I feel like they are updating us as information is being given to them about the COVID crisis, but also as financial decisions are made. And I feel like art and museum transparency is in many ways decentralizing method of any of this information other than the spreadsheet really getting out there onto a social media platform, because you're congregating it in one place and retweeting.
Yeah, I think
employees' personal accounts. These are not institutional accounts. It's people being brave enough and risking their future in their careers by tweeting what just happened at their institution.
Yeah, and so that happened. I was really, really inspired by former colleagues of mine at the PMA, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, earlier this year when they went through a Me Too scenario there, and they were so failed by their leadership that they actually just started saying things themselves because they were not having any kind of real backup from HR and from the director and from leadership. And I think that's happened too in terms of folks saying, you know, this is what's happening at my institution. I think there have been different responses. Some institutions have put public statements out. Certainly the MFA where I work has been very public in terms of giving exact numbers of who's gotten furloughed. And they have said very publicly to news outlets that that's happening. I think that there are different levels of transparency that workers deserve and that they need. And we're not seeing that across the board at all. And the news, as you say, is really often coming from individuals who are saying, you know, I've been furloughed or I've been let go. I think of somebody like Mike Morawski, who was at the Portland Museum in out west, and he has had a distinguished museum education career. He is one half of the hashtag museums are not neutral, and he really has, along with many other people, pioneered such, you know, rich, important conversations about who museums are for. And he is now no longer at Portland because of the COVID cuts. And I know about that because, you know, and everybody who knows about it because he very personally said on his social media channels, I no longer have a job. So yeah, I think there is a really important service being done by those who are speaking up and saying this is what's happening, because it's really important to have an understanding of what the field is, and to centralize that information, to de-silo it. Even, you know, department by department in museums, some people don't know what's happening. And it's a really important thing to sort of know what the general field is for those in it, but also for those coming into it too. I think one of the things that people have talked about, and is really true, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives have been on everybody's tongues over the last couple of years. We started to get to the point, you know, AAMD last year came out with the thought that no museum internship, no arts internship should be unpaid anymore. And I'm really very worried, as I think a lot of people are, that for those just emerging into the field, there's going to be very little support in making sure that those who've been really historically underrepresented as staff members in the field have the support that they need to make this field what it should be.
And that's certainly something that you and I had talked about in depth over the past week as we touched base before this interview. I wonder if we should not demand a radical strategy for rehires at institutions across this country to remedy that. That if institutions are only going to rehire, say, one of three positions that were furloughed or I guess fired, if the POC underrepresented artists, because so often the people who are that artists are educators and visitor services staff are artists. So I always default and say artists, but if those positions are not demanded, as museums open up and as visitor services departments replenish their staffing, I think that that's something that I hope develops out of the conversations that you're bringing to a more public platform.
Yeah, I think it will be, I hope, I mean, in my ideal museum, this would be part of a larger strategy of radical reimagination that would include a lot of things, but, you know, I don't think it's enough to be, to rehire on the basis of radical diversity and inclusion and accessibility if you're rehiring people into jobs that are still badly paid or still so contingent people are afraid that the next time that this happens their career is just going to evaporate again, and so it needs to come at the same time with much better guardrails in terms of part-time contracts. And so this is not something that can happen to part-time educators again, because these are folks who, I mean, I know people who are let go at MoMA, and I've known them for 15 years. They have multiple degrees. They're master teachers. They're experts. It's not just somebody who came in for, you know, a couple of months and does this as a peripatetic job. This is somebody who excels in that job and really is the heart of the museum, welcoming people, interpreting the collection, you know, art historians with PhDs, teaching artists with skills that are incredible, and people who know the collection inside out in ways often curators don't.
Yes. And have, again, as we said earlier, often contributed to the online programming that we're now seeing, especially if you're looking at institutions that are putting up past programs, videos, conversations, performances. The entire structure of that public programming, a lot of these departments have been completely wiped out, which is devastating to think of, that labor is being celebrated at the same time as it's being tossed aside in many ways. I do think we should acknowledge some of the admirable strategies that institutions have taken, at least halfway through. We're gonna get to some more hopeful conversations. I know you and I are both hopeful about building our field as well. But the quote that I come back to again and again is the director of the Walters Museum in Baltimore. I know that you retweeted that, our museum transparency, but Julia Marcieri Alexandra said in a recent interview, we think it's our duty as a civic institution not to contribute to the unemployment crisis, end quote. And there are also salary cuts happening at specifically top level staffing to prevent layoffs, and that's voluntary in many cases, like the Oakland Museum of California. And many museums are also turning to archive and collection projects that employees can complete remotely, such as the Bell. We are actually doing that with collectively as a staff.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I mean, there are many, many good things for all of the like complete implosion that's happening. You know, we can be grateful for many things. We still have, you and I still have our health right now. We have a roof over our heads. There are many, many layers of privilege that exist in the art world that will remain intact now and far after. And there are many really inspiring things that are happening. I'm excited by the things that you mentioned. I'm also looking at initiatives like the Whitney, who retained all their part-time teaching artists and educators and are thinking about how to pivot and connect them with audiences that can meet them online. And I'm hoping that there are also analog projects that come out of this. About 6 years ago, I did a show called This Is For Everyone, Designed for the Common Good, design experiments for the common good. And the first part of that title, This Is For Everyone, came from Tim Berners-Lee's tweet in 2012 as part of the London Olympics opening ceremony. He's the father of the World Wide Web, and he tweeted out to the stadium in London, This Is For Everyone, which is the first sort of tweet that he had made in celebration. And me being the sort of total design Pollyanna that I am, I was thinking, oh, this is so wonderful. Design is great. It's such a social design experiment for the social good. And at that point in time, the internet, I think, was only accessed by 39% of the world's population, 75% of whom lived in only 20 countries. 16% of the US at the time didn't have broadband. And so we are thinking a lot about online projects, but I think the statistic stands now that it's 50% of the world's population that has access to the internet. So if we want to continue thinking in really exciting and innovative ways, I'm hopeful that the great intellectual and compassionate capital that most museums have in their staff can also be thought of in terms of its analog deployment too.
I love that. And I haven't heard anyone say that yet. So thank you for bringing that to our conversation and unleashing it on the world, because I know how much you are admired in our field as a leader in thinking about the future. So I appreciate
I think I feel like there's a lot of good teamwork makes the dream work on that. I'm definitely not the first and will not be the last person to have thought about, I mean, again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, I have more experience as a nanny than I do as a curator. And right now, there are people who really need childcare. They are going out to fill our grocery shelves. They're going out to our ER departments. They're doing a lot of different things. And I just wonder how we could be creative with the deployment of staff. And as the director of the Walters was saying, in terms of not making an employment crisis, think about this as a really instructive lesson for how we prioritize the way in which we fundraise for and save in our institutions going forward. I don't think it will be politically okay, not that I think many of us ever thought it was, to spend $500 million, which is again what the PMA raised, what Guggenheim, Abu Dhabi, other places, millions if not billions of dollars on museum expansions. And the director at the Walters was really clear, and she said, since the downturn in 2008 until 2015, her priority had been building their endowment, making sure that there was a rainy day fund, and it has paid off in that, at least so far, they haven't had to let any staff go. And I think if that's possible, then in moments like this, you can retain your staff and creatively deploy them, ask your community what they need from you, rather than just providing online content that you're not very sure who can access it, who can use it, and to think in all of the creative ways that museum staff are so excellent at doing.
Right. We've been talking about labor and about online content, but I think we really need to think about what exhibitions are going to be prioritized when we come back in person, collectively, as museums reopened after the crisis. I know that, as you mentioned before, there have been some radical exhibition making practices that have grown in the last 5 to 10 years, and we need to fight against the entrenchment of political conservatism and regression to exhibition programs. And I think both of us fear that they will recenter established white male artists, which are absolute moneymakers. They draw crowds, they draw donors, and I don't have answers. I'm just throwing that out there as something that people in our field need to be strategizing about now, so that you're not surprised when this veering in that direction happens once we're all back at a table in a conference room talking about the exhibition schedules.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think everything is also so connected, because if that is where the exhibition schedule veers, and there are people making decisions right now about what is going to be on the schedule now that things have been so grossly disrupted, then I don't think we will attract the new generations of really visionary and diverse talent that museums need to remain relevant. So, and also, when we have people coming back into the museum space after something like COVID, museum visitors' behavior and expectations are going to be so radically different. I don't think people will feel comfortable in terms of being necessarily in the same volume in a small space. Things like reading a wall text, it can't be at the same small font size anymore, because people can't lean in to see it. It's going to need to be a different and actually maybe a much more accessible experience, which I feel like many of our colleagues who work in interpretation and accessibility have been trying to push institutions towards for a long time. So those things could be really positive effects. Unfortunately, I don't know that the folks who will ultimately make these short and maybe mid and long-term decisions about how our exhibition schedules will change may have time or may have the desire to engage in some kind of either community conversation about what makes, for a meaningful exhibition program going forward, or what makes for a robust and critically relevant and equitable exhibition program going forward. And, along with job loss, there is, going back to our main topic of labor, a constriction of labor possibilities in the field. And I think sort of a constriction because so much time is taken up with crisis management right now. So maybe you go for the blockbuster, the white male artists, and that's just another sort of little death knell to the field at large. So I hope those people with decision-making power know that and resist that, because they're investing in the future by resisting it, and conversely, if they don't resist it, only adding to the crisis in the end.
Absolutely. I was sitting in and actually lecturing to our colleague Jamie Lee Lacey's class yesterday on museum studies at Providence College Galleries, and she had the most lovely words of advice to her students about how no matter what their degrees, there were students who were financial studies majors, there were students in the sciences, there were of course art history students, that all of those skills are needed in nonprofits, and that even though you and I have been talking about specifically art museums, but if you expand that into the nonprofit world, that type of talent and thinking and care is going to be needed desperately in the next 5 years, desperately in the next month. And I wonder if you have any advice to maybe the Brown students who are watching this video who want to go into museum work and have wanted to for a long time, or maybe now we're just seeing how important they are, how important art and culture is at this moment when we're all at home, as everyone points out, whether it's Netflix or reading, a novel that was written 200 years ago, how important art is to all of our lives.
For sure. I mean, you cannot have civilization and culture without historians who help keep it and to keep it alive and to keep it within our societies on a daily basis. And so whatever historian looks like geographically, culturally over time, they're incredibly important. I always say that if I had my druthers, and I come from a country where education is free, and so this is where this comes from, but if I had my way, I would make sure that everybody at some point in their life could take a 2-year master's in history. It doesn't have to be art history of some sort, because I just feel it's so fundamentally important. If you know what has happened, you know which parts to repeat and which not. It's an incredible tool for powerfully redesigning systems or keeping certain systems in place if they're important. And so I would say to any student graduating right now, I mean, it's incredibly tough graduating into such a moment of uncertainty. And if you're specifically thinking about the power that art can have in people's lives, or the notion of the museum, about 6 weeks ago, I probably would have said, when I think of what a future museum can be, I was imagining it within the campuses of museums that I've known and loved and worked in myself. Now, I mean, nonprofits and museums, but they can also be hospitals. They can also be social science areas. If you are mission driven and really interested in the ways in which history, visual or otherwise, can change people's lives, that can be applied in almost every field, I think. In my field of contemporary design, I don't think good design can be done without a very firm grasp of history. But I don't know that you have to be a historian practicing in a historical institution anymore. And in fact, I do wonder whether you can do the most good working outside of an institution like that.
I'm glad that you said that, because I do feel that we need to value and give dignity to all labor right now. I know people are certainly appreciating health workers and those deemed essential workers in our farming and food industries. But also, your job doesn't define you, and whatever you majored in or whatever you want to be in the future doesn't need to be immediately satisfied in those first years out of graduation, right? It's about contributing to this crisis and contributing to solving all of the problems that are opening up in this country right now during this crisis. So I think that allowing that flexibility, as you just did, that maybe you are a history major, but you go into a different field or a different type of nonprofit work, is a very valuable takeaway from our conversation. I do think this should be a moment of empathy and solidarity for the museum field and for all arts workers. And I hope to have a conversation with someone from the gallery world to talk about what's happening in that segment of the art world, which is equally decimated by the COVID crisis, but also a collective understanding that we are all vulnerable within our institutions, no matter how powerful you think your position is, and that we all need to care for one another and speak for the people who are less powerful, which is something that you have been doing and something that you have been advocating for since you founded Art and Museum Transparency. But I think knowing you before that, I think you've been doing that for a long, long time.
Well, it's easy to do so when you come from a country like Scotland, where education is free. I didn't graduate with student debt. I come from a very working class family. My mom didn't graduate high school. I'm the first in my family to go through college. And so when you come out of a space where everybody has been given and access to education is still not totally equal. People come from all different backgrounds and stages in Scotland, where I'm from. And so not everyone accesses things equally, but you do have a somewhat more level playing field to get to education there. Same with healthcare, it's free everywhere, all the time. You will never be charged for going into hospital in the country that I come from. To come to a space like this, it seems incredible to me that students have to pay so much for education here, that is not regulated in the ways that it should be, that they have to pay for health insurance, that when people are thinking about losing jobs or not being able to get them, that it is going to constrict not only their possibilities in terms of labor, but in terms of being able to take care of very fundamental things like their own health. That the only thing that we can do is to be really collective with one another, because again, our problems are everybody's problems, and to speak them out loud, because in the good old-fashioned kind of mode of consciousness raising and often women collecting together across generations, across different cultures, being able to speak things out loud is the first step to being able to change things. So yeah, I really hope folks graduating just now know that their strength lies in the power of collectivity with one another.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I think that's a perfect ending to our conversation.
Thank you for having me. Stay well.